Hello. The episode you're about to listen to is part of a multi-part series introducing an overview of Japanese history. This is a repeat of one of the original projects the History of Japan podcast was built on, and is intended to serve as an update and supplement to these original works. After 10 years, my hope is to return to this approach and to do it a little bit better given the skills that I have improved in the intervening years. If you haven't been doing so already, you should listen to these episodes sequentially, starting with episode 501. Without any further ado, enjoy the episode. Hello and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 507, The Culture of Classical Japan, Part 1. Up until now, we've been focusing primarily on the complex political culture of early Japan, and with good reason. If you've been listening for a while now, you know I'm very much a politics-oriented person. Political power shapes so much of the world we live in and the world our ancestors lived in, and spending time discussing it is, at least in my view, important for understanding the world as it is today. But I have been doing you all something of a disservice with that emphasis, because there are some very important developments in the realm of culture during this time period that we do need to talk about because they are going to matter a lot going forward. So that's what the next 2 weeks are all about. Today is going to be all about language, poetry, and religion, especially Buddhism. Next week is going to be a bit more about poetry and more broadly literature during the Heian period. And we're going to start off with what's probably the most important subject of them all, language and writing, since without them, the others wouldn't exist. So, the origins of the Japanese language are a bit unclear. Officially, Japanese and related languages like Ryukyuan belong to what is called the Japonic language family, which is not academically considered to be related to any of the surrounding language groups. It's pretty clear that early Japonic languages came over to the islands from the Korean peninsula with the Yayoi cultures, with the earlier languages of the Jomon people forming the basis for the Emishi and Ainu languages. Those languages, of which only Ainu survives today, are what's called language isolates. We don't know where they came from, nor do we have any clear evolutionary relationship to trace with surrounding languages. Japonic languages are pretty clearly related to the neighboring Koreanic languages, of which the most prominent is, you guessed it, Korean. The two groups share very similar language structures in terms of grammar, which, alongside several centuries of vocabulary borrowing, means it's pretty easy to learn one if you already know the other. Neither Japonic nor Koreanic languages are related at all to the Sinic language family, the family of Chinese languages, of which the most prominent is the Beijing-style dialect known in the West as Mandarin Chinese. There are some theories that tie Japanese and Korean to the Altaic language family, languages spoken by the people originally from the Altai Mountains in Central Asia, of which the most prominent is Turkish. Personally, I think it's pretty likely that both Korean and Japanese are descended from these languages, particularly because they share a rather unique subject-object-verb language structure in terms of how sentences are composed. But the exact nature of Japanese and its relationship to the Altaic languages is a very controversial subject, and we're not really going to explore it here because linguistics is not my specialty. What's important for us is that the distinct nature of Japanese as a language made developing one of the most important things for any language, a writing system, rather challenging. If you know anything about Chinese as a language, you know it's very different from Japanese in 3 crucial respects. First, the basic order of sentences is different. Chinese, like English, is a subject-verb-object language, while Japanese and Korean are both subject-object-verb. Second, Chinese, like English, is what is called an analytic language, while Japanese is agglutinative. Once again, I am not a linguist, so I'm not going to do a good job getting into this or explaining it in too much depth, but my understanding is the key difference is that in agglutinative languages, you add more syllables to the end of a word, especially a verb, to modify meaning. Take the Japanese verb kaku, to write. To make it past tense, you add the suffix ta to the end of it to make kaita, with some changes to the base verb for vowel harmony. To make it formal, you insert the suffix masu in the middle for kakimashita. To make it passive, you add the suffix re to make it kakaremashita. In English, these would all be separate words. I was made to write it. Hopefully this is clear without offending any of the linguists in the audience by oversimplifying. Finally, Japanese has a lot of complicated modifiers for verb tense. Chinese just doesn't. Chinese grammar is extremely simple, honestly to the point of making classical Chinese extremely hard because of how challenging it can be to interpret the specific meaning of words. Broadly, Chinese only distinguishes between complete and incomplete action, and there is no verb conjugation at all, which, as someone who spent 6 years trying to learn a Romance language, fills my heart with profound envy. Why does this matter? Because the very first writing systems in East Asia were derived from, you guessed it, Chinese. The Chinese system of ideographs, thousands of different characters representing words or ideas, works very well for the structure of Chinese as a language, because, of course, it does. But it's very hard to make it render Japanese effectively, at least not without some tinkering behind the scenes. Which brings us to the earliest forms of written Japanese, what we call Old Japanese. Broadly, both this language and Middle Japanese, collectively referred to as Classical Japanese, are similar to modern Japanese. There's the same basic word order, the conjugation follows some similar rules but with some more complicated business going on under the hood, and to be honest, that business nearly broke my soul during the one trimester of Classical Japanese I took. Our earliest written samples of the language are from the Nara era, with the Kojiki itself being both Japan's oldest known history and the first piece of actual Japanese language writing we have. We do have older pieces of writing from Japan, but they are in Classical Chinese, given the enormous influence China had on Japan. Chinese became an elite language in East Asia with a role similar to Latin in medieval Europe, or Arabic in the Islamic world, or Sanskrit in India. Knowing Chinese was both a status marker for members of the elite, demonstrating they were truly educated, and was a way for members of said elite who spoke different languages day to day to talk to each other and share ideas. The earliest form of Japanese writing we have is called Manyō-gana, and originated from the necessity of including Japanese words in that classical Chinese correspondence. For example, a Japanese courtier writing to a counterpart in China would have to figure out a way to render their own name in their letter. To do so, they would pick Chinese characters that were pronounced similarly to the Japanese sound they were intended to represent. And this approach, in turn, eventually formed the basis of Manyō-gana, which uses Chinese characters phonetically to transcribe the sounds of Japanese. If you are a speaker of Chinese or just know your ideographs, called Hanzi in Chinese or Kanji in Japanese, which literally just means Han Chinese characters, this looks like complete nonsense. After all, the Chinese characters are being chosen for their sound, so if you try to read them based on meaning, you get gibberish. Manyō-gana as a writing style is of course best associated with the Manyoshu, literally the collection of 10,000 leaves. The text is a collection of poems. Not quite 10,000 of them, there are precisely 4,536, but in East Asia 10,000 is often used to just mean a great many. And of course, over 4,500 poems definitely counts as a great many. Poetry as a medium is of course very much associated with the refined literati of Asia. For much of Chinese history, the ability to compose poetry was a marker of refinement, good taste, overall quality of character, and other things I don't know that much about. Or at least they would certainly think so. I'm not a very good poet. Anyway, it makes sense that Japanese aristocrats looking to model themselves on their Chinese counterparts would develop an interest in poetry as well. The Manyoshu itself represented an attempt to catalog the poetic accomplishments of Japan's best, compiled by one of the leading men of the time, Otomo no Yakamochi, likely with sponsorship from either Emperor Shōmu or Empress Koken. It's not precisely clear which, because dating the text beyond sometime in the 750s is pretty challenging. Now, we're not going to go too deep into the Manyoshu here because that could be an entire episode in its own right. I do want to note a few things about it that are unique, though. First, it represents a variety of poetic styles, unlike later poetic compendia, which would generally confine themselves to a single format of poem. The text contains mostly 31-syllable tanka, or short poems, but also cholka, long ones as many as 149 lines, a sprinkling of kanshi, or Chinese-style poems, something called busso sekiha, a type of Buddhist memorial poetry, and even a few folk songs. And as the folk songs bit might suggest, it wasn't just aristocrats whose works were included in the Manyoshu. The collection included several poems by common people, which would very much not be the case in later collections. The poems also employ a somewhat different style than those of later generations. Later poets in Japan would try to avoid metaphors or allusions they considered too direct. For example, a poem trying to get you to consider the theme of Buddhist worldly impermanence would never be so direct about things as to directly show a corpse. That's way too on the nose, so to speak. A human body is just too obvious a metaphor for the transience of life and the unavoidable nature of death, and so including it would be considered, for lack of a better term, just basic. Similarly, a poem about love would never depict acts associated with romantic love, like holding hands or, God forbid such vulgarity, kissing. Yet, as Robert Borgin and Joseph Sorensen indicate in their essay on early Japanese literature, both these symbols are used very freely in the Manyoshu, an indicator of how poetic taste, particularly among the elite, would continue to evolve. Both language and poetry would continue to change over the course of the Nara era, and especially after the move of the capital to Heian/Kyoto. During the early Heian years, Japanese-style poetry would briefly fall out of favor for reasons we're going to get to next week. But starting in the 900s, poetry would again come to dominate the elite culture, though their poems would be very different from those of the past. In particular, the 900s are associated with the Kokin Wakashu, or Kokinshu for short, roughly a collection of poems from ancient and modern times. Compiled in 905 under the supervision of one of Japan's greatest poets, Kino Tsurayuki, the Kokinshu came to be something of an aristocratic tastemaker going forward. Unlike the Manyoshu, it contains only one type of poem, waka, or Japanese-style poems, and those poems, of which there are over 1,000, are spread across 20 chapters organized thematically around things like the four seasons or major literary themes, with literally a quarter of the text focusing on the subject of love. While these are very much the ancestors of modern haiku, these poems are different in a few key ways, most notably a reliance on clever wordplay and allusions over simplicity and clarity, which is why they are not generally as well known outside of Japan as later haiku masters are. Anyway, there's a lot more to say about the Kokinshu, and we're going to say some of it next week, but I also want to note that if you're really interested in this subject, we have a whole episode on it in the back catalog, episode 447, if you're looking to know more about the Kokinshu and how it's composed. As for the question of language, it was also during the Heian period that one of the most important shifts in the Japanese language took place, the development of kana. Simply put, writing Japanese using only Chinese characters was not terribly efficient, so over time people began to modify those characters into simpler shapes that could be read purely phonetically. The shape of the characters was visibly derived from Chinese, but visually distinct enough for them to be distinguishable, and these became hiragana, the entirely phonetic script that first-year Japanese students around the world know and love. Hiragana began to emerge in the 800s, but didn't become a universally accepted way of writing Japanese. The association of Chinese with literariness, sophistication, and just general good education meant that Chinese remained the official language of government and elite culture, particularly for aristocratic men, who, if they hoped for a job within the growing government bureaucracy, needed to be able to read and write in the Chinese language, since that was how record-keeping was done. And of course, the language generally served as a marker of education, much as reading and writing in Latin did in Europe until pretty recently. It was mostly aristocratic women, who did have the resources to learn to read and write, but who were not expected to master the complexities of Chinese since they could not serve in government, who were associated with hiragana writing. This association was so strong that hiragana was sometimes called onnade, or women's hand, contrasted with writing in Chinese, otokode, or men's hand. The fusion of these two styles, characteristic of Japanese today, would take place over the next few centuries, and eventually lay the groundwork for the language as it exists now, which makes use of both kanji, Chinese characters, and hiragana. Those developments are a ways off at this point, though, and at any rate, Chinese specifically continued to have a lot of currency as the language of education and elite sophistication, all the way down to the end of feudalism in the mid-1800s. It's also worth noting that all this talk of literature and the arts presents a somewhat distorted view of the Japanese aristocracy during this time. Up until pretty recently, the image of the Heian aristocracy that tended to dominate was one of effete literati more concerned with the quality of poetic composition than with actually running a government. That image emerges from a selective reading of sources like the Kokinshu, which certainly have plenty to say on this subject. The idea being that all of this explains why said aristocrats will be displaced successfully from political power in the coming centuries by more rough and tumble provincial warrior types who did not have the patience for all this poetic nonsense. I have to admit, this used to be my narrative too, but upon doing some more reading, turns out that's a bit unfair. As we've seen over the last few episodes, it's not like these aristocrats didn't care about political power. Fighting over said power within and between the imperial family and various clans has kind of been the theme of the whole show so far. All those famous poets, their talent didn't exactly make them powerful. Kino Tsurayuki, for example, never made it far up the government hierarchy, despite being one of the most celebrated poets of his time. He was made a governor of a remote and unimportant province, and awarded some middling bureaucratic posts and aristocratic ranks. His highest in his lifetime was junior 5th rank upper grade, so about 2/3 up the way of the depth chart, though he was posthumously promoted. By comparison, the most celebrated political leaders of the time were only occasionally talented poets. And it's not like Heian courtiers only cared for aristocratic and refined things. Great writers like Murasaki Shikibu and Sei Shonagon, about whom more next week, noted the popularity among their fellow aristocrats of something called imayo, literally modern songs. Essentially, these were popular vulgar ditties sung by shirabyoshi, essentially sex workers, to entertain their clients. And these kind of songs were so popular that a later emperor actually compiled them into their own collection, Ryojin Hisho, roughly songs to make the dust dance. And these were pretty vulgar by the standards of the time. Here's a rough translation of one, for example. Wine cups and fish that cormorants eat, and women, one never tires of them, let's have sex, the two of us. This is not, by any measure, I think it's fair to say, subtle. So while it's important to know about high aristocratic taste, we shouldn't make the mistake of assuming that high-class writing was the only thing aristocrats liked. Beyond language, of course, one of the most important cultural aspects of this time was the rapid growth of Buddhism as a religion. We covered the origins of Buddhism in a previous episode, so I won't rehash them here. Just to quickly remind you, Buddhism as a religion was already 1,000 years old by the time it first arrived in Japan, somewhere in the mid-500s. The precise date is unclear. The earliest forms of Buddhism to arrive in Japan came from China by way of Korea, and these continental connections made Buddhism, for lack of a better word, very fashionable. This also meant that Buddhism was early on a very aristocratic religion in Japan. As we've already covered, of course, it was one of the aristocratic clans, the Soga, that first began to propagate the religion in the country, and the great temples of Nara were built either by those clans or by the imperial family itself. In addition, at this point in history, East Asian Buddhism, or Mahayana Buddhism in other words, was not quite what it would be later. One of the major splits that emerged between Mahayana and other branches of Buddhism, most notably Theravadan Buddhism, was around the question of karma and enlightenment. Theravadan Buddhism, and generally most forms of early Buddhism, emphasizes the idea that you go through several different lives accumulating good karma, as expressed in increasingly favorable rebirths, before attaining enlightenment and escaping the cycle of reincarnation. Favorable rebirth in this context came to refer to birth into aristocratic families and often birth as a man, making Buddhism very much the ally of political power and elite status. Early Japanese Buddhism very much reflected this context. The vast majority of monks in early Buddhist institutions, with only a few exceptions, focused their efforts on the nation's elite. Temples were concerned not with spreading the message of the Buddha to the masses, but with offering their spiritual power in defense of their elite patrons, and, arguably, in so doing justifying continued substantial economic support. Chief among these dominant forms of early Buddhism was what was called the Hosso sect, whose member temples enjoyed the patronage of the powerful Fujiwara family, with the most powerful Hosso sect temple being Kofukuji in Nara. The move of the capital to Kyoto from Nara was, in part, a way for members of the court to escape the power of existing Buddhist institutions, which over the course of the Nara era had become a big power block within the government. And it was over the course of the early Kyoto years, the Heian period as it's known, that Buddhist theology in Japan began to change, driven by the emergence of two new sects associated with the monks Saicho and Kukai. Saicho was born in 767 in Omi province around Lake Biwa, but moved to Nara as a young man to become a Buddhist monk at Todaiji. While at Todaiji, he was ordained there as a monk in 785, he became interested in a new sect of continental Chinese Buddhism called Tiantai, Tiantai being the name of a mountain where the Chinese monk who founded the school opened his first temple. We are not going to delve too deeply into the theology of Tiantai Buddhism, except to note that it was, in a certain sense, the first Chinese sect of Buddhism, the first one to rework Buddhist theology to incorporate insights derived from native Chinese philosophy, and thus create a uniquely Chinese model of Buddhism. What matters about that for us is that Tiantai sect Buddhism rejected this notion of accumulating karma over time for rebirth, instead emphasizing the idea that anyone could attain a positive rebirth at any time. It was purely a matter of one's efforts in pursuit of enlightenment. And this was a notion that very much spoke to young Saicho, who the very same year he was ordained left Todaiji behind to found a small monastery atop Mount Hiei overlooking Lake Biwa. And this was a fortuitous choice on his part because a few years later, the announcement came the imperial court was moving to Kyoto, very close to Mount Hiei, which fortuitously was also to the northeast of the imperial capital. That direction has inauspicious associations, which is why in both China and Japan, it was common to locate a religious institution to the northeast of the capital, warding away these bad influences. Mount Hiei's temple, known to history as Enryakuji, would help serve this purpose, and before long Saicho himself was offered sponsorship by the imperial court, which he accepted in 796. By 802, Saicho had begun to distinguish himself from his Todaiji roots, and more openly claimed a connection to Chinese-style Tiantai Buddhism, which in Japanese is called Tendai. Saicho was also the one to introduce an important theological innovation in Japanese Buddhism, an emphasis on something called the Lotus Sutra, which will become very important and a foundational document for a lot of branches of Japanese Buddhism. The Sutra of the White Lotus of the True Dharma, or Myoho Renge-kyo in Japanese, is of unknown authorship. All we know is it was composed by Indian monks in the centuries after the death of the Buddha Siddhartha Gautama himself. The theology of the text is, to be frank, way more dense than we can cover here. Simply put, it's a text on the variety of methods to be used for the salvation of sentient beings and the obtaining of enlightenment, but in the process, it establishes a very complicated Buddhist metaphysical reality that would provide the groundwork for future sects like Pure Land, Zen, and Nichiren, all of which we will talk about in the future. Saicho was deeply enamored with the sutra to the extent that he asked for and received imperial permission to go to China for several years to study the Lotus Sutra at Mount Tiantai. The teachings he derived from the Lotus Sutra and brought back to Japan formed the basis of his Tendai sect. However, Saicho was never as popular as the other monk we have to discuss today. The independence of the Tendai sect from existing temples and teachings was not actually fully recognized until after his death in 822. As a result, Saicho spent a good chunk of his career fighting back against pushback from the monasteries of Nara, which were attempting to circumvent his attempts to break basically bureaucratic ties with them and create an independent sect of his own. Early in its history, Enryakuji would struggle financially as a result, and Saicho's sect, while it would eventually grow quite substantial and powerful, would not be as popular as the competing sect associated with Kukai. The man known to history as Kukai was born on the island of Shikoku to a minor noble family who in turn sent him to what was then the capital of Nagaoka-kyo at the age of 14 to study Confucian thought. However, Confucianism's emphasis on politics did not appeal to the young man, who was far more enamored with Buddhism. It's unclear precisely how Kukai entered Buddhist monastic life. He appears to have privately taken Buddhist monastic vows at first, and then when the capital moved to Kyoto, began devoting himself to Buddhist missionary work. This was how he came to the attention of the imperial court, resulting in Kukai being attached to the same Buddhist mission to China of which Saicho was a part during his study of the Lotus Sutra. Kukai, however, ended up making better use, in terms of marketing, of his time in China. He went not to Mount Tiantai, but to the capital of the Tang dynasty at Chang'an. After studying Buddhism at the heart of the empire for several years, he passed a few more at Ximing Temple just outside the city, becoming a student of one of the great Buddhist masters of the time, Huiguo. Huiguo's approach to Buddhism was deeply esoteric. If you don't know what that means, esotericism is essentially an approach to religion that involves the use of complex symbolism with which one engages on an individual level in order to attain profound understanding. The usual vehicles for this in Buddhism would be mandalas, visual representations of the cosmic order, the chanting of mantras, phrases endowed with some kind of spiritual meaning, and the use of mudra, physical movements, especially of the hands, intended to symbolize a certain idea. Kukai found himself very attracted to Huiguo's teachings, referred to as the Junyan, or True Word sect of Buddhism, and so he took them back to Japan, where those characters are read Shingon. Shingon sect Buddhism proved very popular with the imperial court, far more so than the Tendai sect. This was not really on their theological merits, from what we can tell, but because the esoteric nature of the teaching appealed to a court aristocracy that was very fond of anything that had the appearance of providing supernatural or magical powers. Growing popular support made it far easier for Kukai to support the independence of his growing Shingon sect from the temples of Nara, and before long he received permission to build his own temple complex on Mount Koya to the south of what's now Osaka. Kukai's temple, Kongobuji, remains the heart of Shingon Buddhism in Japan today. Kukai also managed to snag a few other powerful concessions indicative of the popularity of his ideas. Chief among them, he was able to secure an imperial decree that only monks of his sect could reside at Toji, one of the temples of the new imperial capital, where he himself had been an abbot for a time. The flipping of such a prominent temple to Shingon, so to speak, was indicative of the support the sect enjoyed among the capital's elite, as was another decree, issued in the year of Kukai's death in 835, that the imperial court would construct a Shingon temple within the imperial palace itself, where Shingon rituals would be performed at the start of each new year for the protection of the imperial court from bad karma. Now, Shingon and Tendai sect Buddhism would eventually become major competitors with the existing Buddhist institutions in Japan, especially the Hoso sect. During the 900s, the Tendai head temple of Enryakuji would have two enormously talented abbots, Ennin and Enshin, who together would help drive the popularity of the Tendai sect up to a comparable level with Shingon among the court nobility. And the competition among the Buddhist sects matters to us for a few reasons. First, the fight over the course of the 800s and 900s to establish the independence of Tendai and Shingon from older temple structures would result in a remaking of the nation's religious bureaucracy. Up until this point, temple lineages were carefully controlled by a state-run bureaucracy that existed as a part of the imperial government. However, the growing independence of sects like Tendai and Shingon led to the dissolution of said bureaucracy as outmoded, allowing temples and sects far more independence in regulating their own internal affairs. That growing independence, however, meant that the temples also no longer received as much funding from the court, which had been the rationale for the supervisory power the court assumed. This in turn made the temples more dependent on fishing for patronage from powerful families, whose funding could make or break a given temple. And that would have powerful implications down the line because aristocratic families were willing to give that favor. Temples like the Tendai sect and Ryakuji, the Shingon sect Kongobuji, and the Hoso sect Kofukuji were able to secure huge amounts of cash as well as land grants in the form of what are called shoen, estates gifted by the government as tax-free parcels to support them. This in turn made the most powerful temples fabulously wealthy, to the point where the temples themselves became powerful institutions in their own right. This is also when those temples, understanding the necessity of protecting the power they had accrued, began developing bands of armed followers to defend them. In future wars, powerful temples would be armed players in the nation's political struggles. Aristocratic support also came with the expectation that temples take on members of the aristocracy interested in Buddhist monasticism, with the unspoken but powerful assumption that members of elite families who joined a given temple would be quickly promoted up the monastic ranks to secure yet more favor from that family. As a result, these establishment temples began to develop a leadership structure dominated by members of the aristocracy, the sons of powerful clans, or sometimes even the imperial family, whose presence and elevation to leadership roles would symbolize the connection between the temple and its patrons. Buddhism was thus even further entrenched as a religion of aristocracy, but even so, at the same time, the seeds of popular Buddhism were being planted. Saicho Kukai's theology was a part of this, with its distinctly Mahayana emphasis on the idea that anyone could attain enlightenment with the right effort. So was the growing visibility of Buddhism in the public eye. A part of the imperial court's justification for its support of Buddhism was the popularization of a rather distinct theology called Honji Suijaku, roughly the true essence and reflected manifestation. In this theory, Buddhist deities, for lack of a better term, the bodhisattvas, the Buddhas, the various mystical figures of Buddhism, were the Honji, the true essence. The native gods of Japan were the Suijaku, manifestations of these Buddhist deities in a distinctly Japanese form. For example, Amaterasu, the goddess of heaven and the sun, was often glossed as a manifestation of Avalokiteshvaru, or Kanzeon to use her Japanese name, the bodhisattva of mercy in the East Asian tradition. This theology was intended to explain how the court could support two different religious traditions and show they weren't that different, and led to a growing intermingling of the two, with shrines and temples often sharing grounds and shrine gods being set up as protector gods of Buddhist institutions. This in turn led to more and more non-aristocratic Japanese, who were not the target of these elite institutions, being exposed to Buddhist ideas. And when those Buddhist ideas began, thanks to this exposure, to find purchase outside the elite in larger numbers, that would lay the groundwork for the explosion of popular Buddhism in future centuries. But we're a long way from that time right now. That's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com, and you can support the network at patreon.com/facingbackward. Special thanks to those who have given at our shoutout tier: Jan Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCulloch, Karen Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William, Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Hrushka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Cat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, an anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, Mark Sy, Gil, Leslie Ikuta, Trash Taste Enjoyer, Harrison Reese, Robbie Martin McAvoy, NihongoKaizen.com, Shimao Toshio's History of Japonesia podcast, A House is a Perfectly Cromulent Mascot, The fish I catch are Rhodes Scholars compared to Samuel Alito, schmuck, and everything changed when the Fire Nation attacked. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week for a bit more on the classic literature of Heian Japan.